Well, here we are. You are hearing the voice of Patricia Angelin of Alba Technique, and you are looking at a very beautiful spray of orchids that were just given to me today by the florist in the same building as the Alba Technique studio. And you are at all the feels at Alba Technique. And here I am, and there you are. So thank you so much for joining me on Instagram Live on this Wednesday, the 28th of April in 2021. We have had a question come in, which is quite thrilling to me, and it's a very good question. And I actually wrote it down in longhand because when I write something down in longhand, it helps me synthesize it a little bit. And the question is as follows. Does every emotion have a counterpart? A counterpart. For example, I find true joy, not just trivial satisfaction, is almost always accompanied by a sense of melancholy. Melancholy. So if every emotion has a counterpart, the second part of the question is, if so, what are some of the other pairings and why those specific connections? And I thank you so much for this question because it really speaks very clearly to what our human intuitive experience of emotion in real life actually is, which is quite different from what Susanne Bloch in her studies found the actual neurologically standard and basic body experience to be. So initially, as a consequence of this, when we start to work with the Alba emoting emotional effector patterns, which is the body patterning, using the breath, the eyes, the openings of the eyes, the tensions and lacks thereof, the postural changes, etc., which comprise the 6 neurologically basic emotions that Susanne Bloch and her colleagues identified over many, many neurobiological studies. There's a mouthful. That it's in the initial work that you would do with me or one of the other master teachers, it is really counterintuitive to human beings. I have seen so many people who just amuse themselves and want to do, emotional explorations. And what they're doing is they're making these long lists of like, this goes with this and this goes with this. So I think that that's a natural human tendency to do that. There's nothing wrong with it. We're hardwired for it, so it's great. But going back to the actual question, does every emotion have a counterpart? I thought about this a lot since fortunately the question came in last evening. And I don't think I can say that the emotions in our limbic systems are counterparts exactly, although it does seem to us that there are. And the example that the querent used is a very, very good one, saying that the querent finds true joy, not just a trivial satisfaction, but true joy is almost always accompanied by a sense of melancholy. So what that would do is create a juxtaposition felt in the body with joy on the one hand, and the person knows that one is joyful. And that, of course, that begs the question, define joy. But anyway, joy is what this person has said, and also concomitantly feels what feels like not the joy, which is a melancholy, and melancholy is an ancient concept of a sustained mood or state of emotion, usually that's on a through base for a certain amount of time, and that this person has experienced this as whenever the individual is feeling joy, there's also a sense of melancholy involved, and that would be in Alba technique, neurologically basic terminology, would be the joy is mixed with sadness. Now, the person asking the question might say to me, no, Pat, I didn't say it was mixed with sadness. I said I had joy, and when I'm feeling what I would identify as real joy, there's almost always a little bit of a melancholic tinge to it, almost as though we're painting emotionally, and it's never pure joy, it's always melancholy. Well, so that would be a counterpart, sadness to joy. I don't think that the other 6 that she has identified as being neurologically standard or basic to all human beings in their pure forms, what we have when we're teeny tiny little babies, when we just come into the world, and those 6, to remind you, are anger, fear, sadness, joy, tenderness, and erotic. So those 6, it's not that erotic has a counterpart in anger, or fear has a counterpart in tenderness. Exactly. Not exactly. Because that would be like saying the 3 primary colors of pigment. Let me see if I can remember what they are. Oh, they are, what are the 3 primary? The red and blue and yellow, I think. So red is not a counterpart of yellow, and yellow is not a counterpart of blue. They are basic. So according to Alba emoting, Susanna would say, no, they're not counterparts. There are, well, she never would have said what they are. They're not counterparts. They simply are. So I would have to say no. He says, if so, what are some of the other pairings? And why are those specific connections? And I loved that he said connections because neuroconnectivity is what is happening here. So I think to go back to why this perception happens and why the question even came up is because of what's intuitive in our personal, real life, authentically felt experience in life. All of us as adults. And it has to do with how complicated we are. We're so complicated. You read that the theory of Susanna Bloch and her colleagues is that there are these 6 emotions, and the initial reaction for most people is, you're reducing my emotions to only 6? Give me a break. I am really complicated. I have joy and it's mixed with melancholy. Or I have tenderness and there's also sadness in my tenderness, in the memories that are associated. Whenever I feel tender, I feel a little bit sad. So yeah, I get why the question is asked. It is very, very exciting, and it is at the heart of my work with Alba technique. It is utilizing Susanna Bloch's magnificent neurobiological studies over many years with using actors as naive subjects from various countries, Chile, and Denmark and Spain and France, when she was at the CNRS in Paris as director of the research laboratory. So all of these different studies, it took them a long time to decide what words they were going to use. And initially, joy wasn't joy. Joy was laughter. So, and that would be because we see what we observe in ourselves and in other people. And the simplest, most pure form of joy is laughter. But it's way more complicated than that, of course, in grown-ups. And even in teenagers and in children, gradually as we come through life and get more and more experiences and go on our little pilgrim's journey of life, we become more complicated, more and more and more and more complicated. Until we begin to let go of certain things as we're able to, and our friends and our colleagues and our difficult experiences and our wonderful experiences help us to learn how to let go of what is no longer needed. And that's when kind of life and freedom begins, I think, because what we hold on to that is no longer useful to us is usually at least approximate cause, of a lot of our difficulties in life and certainly in relationships. So we are mentally hardwired, I made a note to myself here, to name things, to put things in labels, to box, to organize. Our minds are organized to organize. And is this a bad thing? No. How could this be a bad thing? Because it is a thing, and all human beings do it. Ergo, it must be good. And then we draw conclusions based upon our own observation of the self and of the other. And that is really, observations of the natural world are the basis of all science. They're the basis of all studies. Going back, we like to think that we kind of discovered science, sort of sometime maybe in the 1880s or so. But really, that is terribly arrogant of us. If you look back in history, and if you really look at all the inventions that were being made, Archimedes' screw and Ptolemy and math, and, all people in all places were making with really what should be called scientific discoveries insofar as questions occur in the human mind. Then we look around ourselves to see what we can see, and we draw conclusions. We make deductions, and as early as I looked this up, correlation is not causation. You've heard as a very strong scientific principle right now, which is sometimes in some studies it's gone against, but it's a mathematical principle that I think was that quote, causation correlation does not imply causation. And it's often attributed to a Dr. Herbert West in the 1880s. And this is the same decade of human history when a lot of people were philosophers, and they were observers of the natural world and explorers and all of this sort of thing. Colonizers, and lots of negative things were coming out of it, but many positive things were coming out of this thirst for human knowledge and human observations in the unknown. So the 1880s was when there was a great deal of interest in emotion. The 1880s, Freud concluded that all of our problems are basically about sex. Well, they're not. But, he was definitely onto some things, and some of our problems very definitely, do have to do with that. And then we get to Adler, and he had a different basic, what are all the problems are, and Carl Jung, what are all the problems. But William James and Carl Lange, Swede, Lange, Englishman James, and in the 1880s, he asked the question, what is emotion? And published his thoughts in the periodical Mind. And you can look that up. I mean, it's still available. And he came to these conclusions in the 1880s at the same time that Carl Lange did, independently in Sweden. They did not know each other or about what the other person was thinking. So going back to the question, what we want to do is naturally name, to label, to categorize, to organize. And this is because we have a will and a drive to know. But emotions are messy, and it's really hard to know them. And we are trapped in our own bodies in that way a little bit. So what happens is that we experience internally something like this wonderful, joyous thing, and yet there is a tinge of melancholy that is involved with it. And so the other person thinks that all joy is tinged with melancholy. And it's not true. Magnetic imaging resonance, MRIs, are now able to prove, we're actually able to see the brain and firing, and we're taking some of the things that Susanne Bloch and her colleagues identified, and we're able to observe them. But when we all talk about emotion normally, we have trouble deciding what words to use. Because my experience of the words to use are going to be necessarily different from the words that you're going to use in regarding when we're trying to get at what we think might be the same feeling that we have. So difficult. So to finally answer this question, does every emotion have a counterpart? No, not directly. each one of the 6 neurologically basic emotions defined in the theory, it is a theory of Susanna Bloch and her colleagues, are completely separate. But they are perceived in our individual bodies because of our adulthood as we're in complex mixtures of all of these. So outside of an exercise, or if you're an actor who's studied Alba technique with me, and I see there's someone who has joined us who is an actor, Mr. John Haslam. Hello, John, who is an adept and is mastering Alba technique, which necessarily means that he's been working for a long time in the Alba emoting emotional effector patterns. And he's also, and some of the other somatic exercises and Qigong and things that I bring in at Alba technique to expand and deepen and heighten and broaden the work that Susanna Bloch did in Alba emoting. So when one gets it in the body and is able to delineate those 6, one from the other, one realizes in the body questionnaire that it's not that joy has a counterpart in sadness exactly, although that is the one that certainly would make sense that, yeah, it does, because the body patterning is not quite, but almost opposite with joy and sadness. But it's not direct. There aren't, quote, pairings, as he says in the question. And as to why those specific connections happen, this is where it gets really fun. The connectivity that happens neurologically is going to be different in you, questioner, than it is in me. So what you, for example, define as your sadness is not my sadness. And neither you nor I have universal sadness in our normal everyday life most of the time. And when I say universal sadness, for example, it needs to be quickly mentioned that there are levels, degrees, intensities might be a better word, from just a tiny, tiny, tiny little bit of relaxation, and then ratcheting up, if you will, or we could maybe say down in terms of relaxation, and the breath is involved, and the different muscles are involved and everything, until we get down to if joy was first defined as laughter in the studies, then obviously, what would the researchers looking for words, they would look at a result, and the result of sadness was crying. And that would be something that almost all of us would recognize in another human being. If another human being has water coming out of the lacrimal glands, in other words, if the other person is crying, we know, whether we speak their language or not, or whether we're from the same culture or not, we know that they are sad to one degree or another. Because that's what the lacrimal glands do, is they wash out the eyes. And so there's a lot of connection. There's neuroconnectivity. There are these signals that your brain, that the limbic system in your brain is sending out when you feel an emotion. And going back again to the 1880s, what was observed and posited by Carl Lange and William James was that this these feelings that we have of joy tinged with melancholy are actually, I'm like losing my words here all of a sudden, it's late in the day here. It's not that we feel the feeling first, which is how we perceive it. It's not that we know what feeling we have first. It's that we feel the feeling first. So in other words, the limbic system of the brain, only one step more advanced evolutionarily than the autonomic nervous system, which would cause you to be able to breathe, your heartbeat, and your essential organs to function even if you're comatose. That'd be the autonomic nervous system governing that. But the next step up in our evolution was, in this limbic system, arguably. And that happens before. So you get the biochemical release, and you feel the emotion, that joy tinged with a little bit of melancholy. And then your brain knows that you feel joy mixed with melancholy. So that's the order that it happens in. It happens in the brain first, and we have the felt feeling second. So when we're having all the feels, we can literally have all 6 of those things going on at once. Things can get that complicated. And in order to be able to have this be more than theory, that you and I are talking about here right now in answer to this excellent question, alas, I have to tell you, you have to experience it in your own body, because otherwise it's just theory. It's all intellectual, and it has to be felt in your body, and you have to feel the blocks that happen, from the universal patterning in your body because of your body habits that are conditioned in you by your response over a lot of time, usually, unless it's a seriously traumatic event, in which case it can all hit you, boom, like that, and linger for days, weeks, months, decades, or go stealth and go silent, and then, excuse me, that was my sister calling in. She knows that I'm doing this with you right now, but she will call in anyway. So what happened with me? I went, oh my goodness, how do I do this? It's technology. I will have to hang up on my sister. She will be so hurt. She's had her COVID second vaccine, and she's having problems with symptoms. So I had a fear reaction, which I didn't think, ooh, I am afraid. I felt it, the biochemicals. I had a little bit of an adrenaline, which let me go, boom, right to the source of cutting my sister off. And then I'm back to you explaining what happened specifically in that moment. It was so interesting. There was nothing to be afraid of. Why did I need to fear? But there's no why to it. It's not reasonable. Our feelings are not reasonable, nor do our feelings reason. It's one of the most wonderful things about them, and it's one of the most difficult things about them. So again, with the naming and the labeling, I'm just looking at some notes here that I made in answer to this question. The 2 of the forms of reasoning, logic. We know that if we're going to utilize logic to approach a problem or a question, if we get the premise wrong for the logic, because logic, builds on like building blocks of a building on a single foundation of a question, the whole thing will be wrong. But it'll seem like it's not. Because if you don't know you're going from a false premise, you think that the conclusion is logical. And hence we get into a lot of difficulty with talking with people about human emotion because they have the logical observation over time that life experience is that this happens and this happens and this happens. And therefore, ergo, the individual knows what they are feeling. Whereas I go, yeah, but the premise is wrong. You don't know first, you know second or third with the prefrontal cortex. And then there's deductive reasoning, which I would always prefer myself to logic. And I think many, if not most, artists do, because you're looking at the world and you're pulling together strands and you're seeing what goes together and what conclusions you can draw. And, that's why it was so necessary to say, yeah, but if one thing correlates with another thing, and you've deduced that this correlates with that, it doesn't mean that this caused that, even though in a lot of situations it looks that way. The earth is flat, would be an example of that. Everybody's experience up until that time, they're looking at horizon lines, they thought that there was a drop-off, at the end of what they could see. And we look at that and go, yeah, right. But it wasn't stupid at the time. We have a tendency to look at our ancestors and think that they were either stupid or not well-meaning. And doggone it, we've got to stop doing that to our ancestors. Were they frequently wrong? Yeah. But you know what? So are we. give us 50 years, 100 years, 200 years. Our descendants are going to be saying, Pat, how could you possibly have thought? And I hope will be looking in bliss and going, I was working with the information I had. fMRIs came in and we got more information. And yeah, but we went with what we had. So we got to stop dissing our ancestors for what they didn't know. There's plenty of stuff we don't know yet anyway. So it's really, in a way, it's about personal experience and the collection of data. And we are trying to collect data about our experiences so that we know what to do with them, how to apply them, how to know the world and how to know ourselves, and know each other. And that's really what it gets down to. So with emotion, we feel like they have counterparts, but they don't in the way that you were asked. They have a simplicity each within each that can be experienced by doing certain exercises that help the body kinetically or somatically delineate, separate, in the case of the question, the joy from the melancholy. So it's not to say that one wasn't experiencing what one was experiencing. You were. You're experiencing joy, and you have a concomitant melancholy mixing in with it, and you recognize it. But you have to understand that the accuracy is that the joy is not causing your melancholia. It's, as you said, connections. It's connectivity, that there are experiences in your past which of loss, probably, of loss and of fear that get involved when the body-mind continuum feels the joy and no one feels the joy. I think the simplest observation could be that when we have a really wonderful joy, the mind fears losing it. The mind fears that it will never come again. The mind fears a lot of things. And then the melancholy, the sadness of, this is going to be lost. I feel this now, but in 5 minutes I will not feel this. When of course we won't in 5 minutes, but if the mind of the individual is conditioned, connected, and the connections, the electrical connections do, how shall I say this? They repeat themselves. Wonderful book I mentioned last time, The Body Keeps the Score. And the psychiatrist who wrote it is talking about traumatic situations in people's lives. And I think that there are more traumas in more people's lives than we have acknowledged up until, maybe the past 10 years, 20 years, 30, certainly 30 years. We didn't acknowledge that trauma needs to be more broadly defined. Just like 60 years ago, we didn't realize that if we had a traumatic brain injury, that we could recover from that. We didn't realize that if we had a stroke, we could recover the connectivity, the glial cells, and the talking, the way our bodies and minds talk, and the electrical system of the brain, that they can be reignited. Or if that particular connectivity is dead, it can be rerouted by the brain. So I think our emotions serve so many wonderful purposes and are at the root of our humanness. We are in danger of losing. I think we are losing a lot of our humanness. Many people have been talking about this lately. Our fascination with artificial intelligence, with AI, I think is at least partly a natural human realization that we're so looking at things weirdly. We're looking at things in groups and in ideologies at the same time that we're insisting on absolute individualism in ways that don't, in human ways on the ground, don't mix very well. If I start to look at you, see, how can I say this without being so specific as in a negative way? Someone said to me, I was talking about a merchant who offered something that would have been helpful to the individual who's speaking to me. And he said, oh yeah, I really, used something from this merchant before, but then I found out what the merchant's politics were. And so, I'm not going to buy anything from him anymore because he doesn't agree with me politically. And internally I went, let's give each other a break. We've all been through a pandemic. We're still in a pandemic. The fears are being ignited are making all of our complicated emotions more complicated. And they're also making our reactivity more acute at times. So please be kind to yourselves. Thank you so much for the question. If there are any further questions or if I didn't hit it for you, please do let me know. And I will see you again, I hope, on Facebook Live next week at the same time. Or if your friends have not, or you are not able to do it, you can always access it by subscribing to the Alba Technique YouTube channel. And as of tomorrow, this will be uploaded there. Thank you so much. It's been wonderful to be with you.